Welcome everyone. It is 3 p.m. and it's time for the Server Room Show. This is episode 75. Today I record the last episode of a three-part episode about the recollection or the story or the history of Digital Equipment Corporation. I started this series, this three-part series eventually started with episode 73, then 74 and 75. Now it's part 3, which is the final episode concluding the story of Digital Equipment Corporation. There is not much left to talk about, but there are still some to discuss about this once great company. Networking and clusters. In 1984, DEC launched its first 10 megabit Ethernet. Ethernet allowed scalable networking, and VEX cluster allowed scalable computing. Combined with DECnet and Ethernet-based terminal servers, DEC had produced a networked storage architecture which allowed them to compete directly with IBM. Ethernet replaced token ring and went on to become the dominant networking model in use today. In September 1985, DEC became the fifth company to register a .com domain name, DEC.com. Along with the hardware and protocols, DEC also introduced the VEX cluster concept, which allowed several VEX machines to be tied together into a single large storage system. VEX clusters allowed a DEC-based company to scale their services by adding new machines to the cluster at any time, as opposed to buying a faster machine and using that to replace a slower one. The flexibility this offered was compelling and allowed DEC to attack high-end markets formerly out of their reach. Diversification. The PDP-11 and VEX lines continued to sell in record numbers. Better yet, DEC was competing very well against the market leader IBM, taking an estimated $2 billion away from them in the mid-80s. In 1986, DEC's profits rose 38% when the rest of the computer industry experienced a downturn, and by 1987 the company was threatening IBM's number one position in the computer industry. At its peak, DEC was the second largest computer company in the world with over 100,000 employees. It was during this time that the company branched out development into a wide variety of projects that were far from its core business in computer equipment. The company invested heavily in custom software. In the 1970s and earlier, most software was custom written to serve a specific task, but by the 1980s, the introduction of relational databases and similar systems allowed powerful software to be built in a modular fashion, potentially saving enormous amounts of development time. Software companies like Oracle became the new darlings of the industry, and DEC started their own efforts in every hot niche. In some cases, several projects for the same niche. Some of these products competed with DEC's own partners, notably RDB, which competed with Oracle's products on the VEX, part of a major partnership only a few years earlier. Although many of these products were well designed, most of them were DEC only or DEC centric, and customers frequently ignored them and used third-party products instead. This problem was further exacerbated by Olson's aversion to traditional advertising and his belief that well-engineered products would sell themselves. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on these projects at the same time. Workstations using RISC microprocessors were starting to approach VEX CPUs in performance. Faltering in the market. As microprocessors continued to improve in the 1980s, it soon became clear that the next generation would offer performance and features equal to the best of DEC's low-end mini-computer lineup. Whereas the Berkeley, RISC and Stanford MIPS designs were aiming to introduce 32-bit designs that would outperform the fastest members of the VAX family, which was DEC's cash cow. Constrained by the huge success of their VAX VMS products, which followed the proprietary model, the company was very late to respond to these threats. In the early 1990s, DEC found its sales faltering and its first layoffs followed. The company that created the mini computer, or dominant networking technology, and arguably the first computers for personal use, had abandoned the low-end market whose dominance with the PDP-8 had built the company in a previous generation. Decisions about what to do about this threat led to infighting within the company that seriously delayed their responses. One group suggested that every possible development in the industry be poured into the construction of a new VAX family that would leapfrog the performance of the existing machines. This would limit the market erosion in the top end segment, where profit margins were maximized and the DEC could continue to survive as a mini computer vendor. This line of thought led eventually to the VAX 9000 series, which were plagued with problems when they were first introduced in October of 1989, already 2 years late. The problems took so long to work out, and the prices of the systems were so high that DEC was never able to make the line, the success they hoped. Others within the company felt that the proper response was to introduce their own RISC design and use those to build new machines. However, there was little official support for these efforts, and no less than 4 separate small projects ran in parallel at various labs around the US. Eventually, these were gathered into the DEC Prism project, which delivered a credible 32-bit design with some unique features allowing it to serve as the basis of a new VAX implementation. Infighting with the teams dedicated to DEC's Big Iron made funding difficult, and the design was not finalized until April of 1988 and then cancelled shortly after. Another group concluded that new workstations like those from Sun Microsystems and Silicon Graphics would take away a large part of DEC's existing customer base before the new VAX systems could address the issues, and that the company needed its own Unix workstations as soon as possible. Fed up with the slow progress on both the RISC and VAX fronts, a group in Palo Alto started a Skunkworks project to introduce their own systems. Selecting the MIPS processor, which was widely available, introducing the new DEC Station series with the model 3100 on the 11th of January 1989. These systems would see some success in the market, but were later displaced by similar models running the alpha. The 32-bit MIPS and 64-bit alpha systems. Eventually in 1992, DEC launched the DEC chip 21064 processor, the first implementation of their alpha instruction set architecture, initially named Alpha AXP. The AXP was a non-acronym and was later dropped. This was a 64-bit RISC architecture as opposed to the 32-bit CISC architecture used in DVAX. It is one of the first pure 64-bit microprocessor architectures and implementations rather than an extension of an earlier 32-bit architecture. The Alpha offered class-leading performance at its launch, and subsequent variants continued to do so into the 2000s, along with the Alpha-derived Pentium Pro 2 and 3 CPUs. An Alpha Server SC45 supercomputer was still ranked number 6 in the world in November 2004. Alpha-based computers comprising the DEC AXP series, later the Alpha Station and the Alpha Server series, respectively superseded both the VEX and MIPS architecture in DEC's product line. They supported OpenVMS, DEC OSF-1 AXP, later known as Digital Unix or True 64 Unix, and Microsoft's then new operating system Windows NT, an operating system made possible by ex-Digital Equipment Corporation engineers. In 1998, following the takeover by Compaq Computers, a decision was made that Microsoft would no longer support and develop Windows NT for the Alpha series computers, a decision that was seen as the beginning of the end for the Alpha series computers. The final years, as its peak in the late 1980s, DEC had 14 billion US dollars in sales and ranked among the most profitable companies in the United States. With its strong staff of engineers, DEC was expected to usher in the age of personal computers, but the autocratic and trend-resistant Mr. Olsen was openly skeptical of the desktop machines, saying the personal computer will fall flat on its face in business, and regarding them as toys used for playing video games. DEC's fortunes declined after missing out on some critical market shifts, particularly toward the personal computer. The board forced Olsen to resign as president in July of 1992. Robert Palmer, in June 1992, Ken Olsen was replaced by Robert Palmer as the company's president. DEC's board of directors also granted Palmer the title of Chief Executive Officer CEO, a title that had never been used during DEC's 35-year existence. Palmer had joined DEC in 1985 to run semiconductor engineering and the manufacturing. His relentless campaign to be CEO and success with the Alpha microprocessor family made him a candidate to succeed Olsen. At the time, a more modern logo was designed as well. Palmer restructured DEC into 9 business units that reported directly to him. Nonetheless, DEC continued to suffer record losses, including a loss of 260.5 million US dollars for the quarter that ended on the 30th of September 1992. It reported 2.8 billion US dollars in losses for its fiscal year 1992. The 5th of January 1993 saw the retirement of John F. Smith as Senior Vice President of Operations, the second in command at DEC, and his position was not filled. A 35-year company veteran, he had joined DEC in 1958 as the company's 12th employee, passing up a chance to work for Bell Laboratories in New Jersey to work for DEC. Smith rose to become one of the 3 senior vice presidents in 1987 and was widely considered among the potential successors to Ken Olsen, especially when Smith was appointed Chief Operating Officer in 1991. Smith became a corporate spokesman on financial issues and had filled in at travel spots for which Olsen ordered more attention. Smith was passed over in favor of Palmer when Olsen was forced to resign in July 1992, though Smith stayed on for a time to help turn around the struggling company. In June 1993, Palmer and several of his top lieutenants presented their reorganization plans to applause from the board of directors, and several weeks later, DEC reported its first profitable quarter in several years. However, on 15th of April 1994, DEC reported a loss of 183 million US dollars, 3 to 4 times higher than the loss many people on Wall Street had predicted, compared with a loss of 30 million US dollars in the comparable period a year earlier, causing the stock price on the New York Stock Exchange to plunge 5.875 US dollars to 23 US dollars. Sorry, to plunge 5,875 to 23 US dollars, 20% drop. Maybe this number is not good here. Yeah, something with this number is bad, so I will fix this in the show notes. The losses at that point totaled 339 million US dollars for the current fiscal year. Sales of the VAX, along the company's biggest moneymaker, continued to decline, which in turn also hurt DEC's lucrative service and the maintenance business. This made up more than a third of DEC's revenue of 14 billion US dollars in the 1993 fiscal year, which declined 11% year over year to 1.5 billion in the most recent quarter. Market acceptance of DEC Alpha computers and chips had been slower than the company had hoped, even though Alpha sales for the quarter estimated at 275 million US dollars were up significantly from the 165 million US dollars in the December quarter. DEC had also made a strong push into personal computers and workstations, which had even lower margins than Alpha computers and chips. Also, DEC was playing catch up with its own Unix offerings for client-server networks, as it long emphasized its own VMS software, while corporate computer users based their client-server networks on the industry standard Unix software, of which Hewlett-Packard was one of the market leaders. DEC's problems were similar to that of larger rival IBM, due to the fundamental shift in the computer industry that made it unlikely that DEC could ever again operate profitably at its former size of 120,000 employees, and while its workforce had been reduced to 92,000 people, many analysts expected that they would have to cut another 20,000. The Selloffs during the profitable years up until the early 1990s, DEC was a company that boasted that it never had a general layoff. Following the 1992 economic downturn, layoffs became regular events as the company continually downsized to try to stay afloat. Palmer was tasked with the goal of bringing DEC back to profitability, which he attempted to do by changing the established DEC business culture, hiring new executives from outside the company, and selling off various non-core business units. Worldwide training was spun off to form an independent or new company called Global Knowledge Network. RDB, DEC's database product, was sold to Oracle. Rights to the PDP-11 line and several PDP-11 operating systems were sold to Mentec in 1994, through DEC continued to produce some PDP-11 hardware for a few years. Disk and the DLT technologies was sold to Quantum Corporation in 1994. Text Terminals business, BT100 and its successors, was sold in August 1995 to Boundless Technologies. Corba-based product Object Broker and its messaging software MessageQ were sold to BEA Systems Inc. in March of 1997. Printer businesses was sold in 1997 to Genicom, now Tally Genicom, which then produced models bearing the digital logo. Networking business was sold circa 1997 to Cabletron Systems and subsequently spun off as Digital Network Products Group. DEC Talk and DEC Voice voice products were spun off and eventually arrived at Phoenix Speech Group. Through 1997, DEC began discussion with Compaq on a possible merger. Several years earlier, Compaq had considered a bid for DEC, but became seriously interested only after DEC's major divestments and refocusing on the internet in 1997. At that time, Compaq was making strong moves into the enterprise market, and DEC's multi-vendor global services organization and the customer support centers offered the real opportunity to expand their support and sales worldwide. Compaq was not interested in a number of DEC's product lines, which led to the series of Selloffs. Notable among these was DEC's Hudson Fab, which made most of their custom chips, a market that made little sense to Compaq's industry standard marketing. This led to an interesting solution to the problem of selling of the division for a reasonable profit. In May 1997, DEC sued Intel for allegedly infringing on its alpha patents in designing the original Pentium Pro and Pentium 2 chips. As part of a settlement, much of DEC's chip design and fabrication business was sold to Intel. This included DEC's strong ARM implementation of the ARM computer architecture, which Intel marketed as the X-Scale processors, commonly used in pocket PCs. The core of digital semiconductor, the Alpha microprocessor group, remained with DEC, while the associated office buildings went to Intel as part of the Hudson Fab. On 26 January 1998, what remained of the company was sold to Compaq in what was the largest merger up to that time in the computer industry. At the time of Compaq's acquisition announcement, DEC had a total of 53,500 employees, down from a peak of 130,000 employees in the 1980s or during the 1980s, but it still employed about 65% more people than Compaq to produce about half the volume of sales revenues. After the merger closed, Compaq moved aggressively to reduce DEC's high selling general and administrative costs and bring them more in line with Compaq's expense ratio of 12% of revenues. Compaq used the acquisition to move into enterprise services and compete with IBM, and by 2001 services made up over 20% of Compaq's revenues, largely due to DEC employees inherited from the merger. DEC's own PC manufacturing was discontinued after the merger closed, as Compaq did not wish to compete with one of its key partner suppliers. The remainder of digital semiconductors, the Alpha microprocessor group, was sold to Intel, which placed those employees back in their Hudson, Massachusetts office, which they had vacated when the site was sold to Intel in 1997. Compaq struggled as a result of the merger with DEC and was acquired by Hewlett-Packard in 2002. Compaq and later HP continued to sell many of the former DEC products, but rebranded with their own logos. For example, HP now sells what were formerly DEC's StorageWorks disk tape products as a result of the Compaq acquisition. The digital logo till 2004, even after the company ceased to exist, as the logo of Digital Global Soft, an IT services company in India, which was a 51% subsidiary of Compaq. Digital Global Soft was later renamed HP Global Soft, also known as the HP Global Delivery India Center, and no longer uses the digital logo. This was the end of part 3 of this 3-part episode of the story of Digital Equipment Corporation. a series I wanted to do, something I wanted to do for a long time, but I never came around. And as I mentioned throughout these episodes 73, 74, and 75 of this one, I most probably will do a separate episode on the wax line of products, for example, and maybe I look into some other bits and pieces if I see that it's worth the attention. Good thing is that if you want to go down on memory lane and experience these PDP machines, for example, or the VAX machines, SimAge emulator has awesome support for both PDPs and VAX machines, and you can play with those some of those mentioned operating systems and experience some part of history. It was an interesting series to make because I personally liked Compaq always, and I like the alpha servers. I never actually owned one, but I always wanted to get one, but I settled for software emulation, running OpenVMS on it, and also PDP, which I have emulators with SimAge and others for it when I have that nostalgic feeling. And yeah, these stories, this recollection of stories, are great way to look at how quick a company can turn upside down, so to say, from being profitable on top to getting into a strong and quick decline if it avoids to listen to the actual trends and to see the flow of events, so to say. With DEC, it was definitely the one of the main reasons was to neglect the home computer era, when those IBM PC machines and the home computing was spreading like fire among the people and in the market, and other companies which realized that this trend is something which is going to be successful, and it's here to stay, and they're not going to go away just that quick. Those companies, or those are the companies which survived this era, so to say, or this change in trends. I hope you have enjoyed this 3-part series on the history of Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC for short. And as always, if you want to reach out, just send me an email, or just say hi, or just let me know that you listen to this show and what your thoughts on it. We'll see you next Saturday with something new.